Good evening, everyone. I am Dean Taifa, Assistant Dean of Students for Diversity and Leadership Development. I, along with my team, which includes Nadia Glover, Park Faison, Sarah Gary, and Isaiah Franco, lead the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, or ODI, as you all may know it. As an office, ODI has a social responsibility to acknowledge the historical context in which Wofford currently exists. As a result, we endeavor to acknowledge that we gather as an institution of higher learning on the ancestral lands of Indigenous peoples past and present, and honor with gratitude the land itself, and thank Mr. Tommy Cabe, an enrolled member of the Cherokee Nation and his tribe, for their involvement in helping us learn more about the people who are linked to the land Wofford currently occupies. We also acknowledge the enslaved Africans who labored to lay the physical foundations of the college. As a result, ODI as an office commits to actively engaging and learning about the history of the lands we occupy, how to be better stewards of it, and continue to honor with intention and respect the historical and current significance of Indigenous and enslaved peoples who suffered in the creation of the college and who are credited for its current existence. Before I turn the program over to Sarah Geary, I do want to acknowledge our panelists, Dr. Adcock, and our other panelists, Tommy Cabe. And Tommy, I don't believe will be able to join us. And so I hope that you all can send him good wishes and positive energy throughout tonight. And so I will now turn the program back over to Sarah Geary, a third-year religion major from the Charleston, South Carolina area and a student coordinator for the Office of Diversity and Inclusion.
Thank you, Dean Taifa, and good evening, everyone. As Dean Taifa mentioned, my name is Sarah Geary, and I'm a student coordinator for ODI. I've had the privilege of working with Dean Taifa, Dr. Miriam Thomas, Nadia Glover, and Dr. Sissy Fowler to bring tonight's speaker virtually, Dr. Trey Adcock, to the Wofford community in order that we may grow in our understanding of land acknowledgements and how they can be used as tools to not only recognize the ancestral lands of Indigenous communities, but also allow us to look toward the future in building intentional, meaningful relationships with Indigenous communities and being better inhabitants of the lands we occupy. On behalf of ODI, I would like to take a moment to thank Dr. Lawton and Dr. Miles for their generous financial support in making this event a reality. To help frame this discussion about land acknowledgements, land and labor acknowledgements, I will begin by introducing Dr. Adcock, who will share his experiences, both rewarding and frustrating, in establishing a land acknowledgement at UNC Asheville. Then after we go through some questions with Dr. Adcock, we will allow some time for questions from the audience. Throughout the session, as you have questions, please privately submit them to Dean Taifa using the chat feature, and we will make every effort to answer each question, time permitting. And finally, we will end our program with some parting words from Dr. Thomas on how we can educate ourselves more on these topics. Dr. Trey Adcock is an associate professor of interdisciplinary studies and the director of American Indian and Indigenous Studies at the University of North Carolina, Asheville. He was named one of the 7 National Public Engagement Fellows in 2018 by the Whiting Foundation for his work documenting a Bureau of Indian Affairs run day school in the Tutyee Snowbird Cherokee community. He obtained his PhD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where he was a Sequoia dissertation fellow focusing on technology integration at an American Indian boarding school in Oklahoma. Dr. Adcock's work has been published in the Journal of American Indian Education, Teaching Tolerance and Readings in Race, Ethnicity, and Immigration. He currently serves on the Executive Council of the Center for Native Health and on the editorial board for the Journal of Cherokee Studies. Dr. Adcock, thank you for joining us this evening. Unlike some of our peer institutions, Wofford College does not have an official land acknowledgement or formal statement, but recognizes and respects Indigenous peoples as ancestral stewards of the land the college currently occupies at 429 North Church Street, or other off-campus locations. Can you share more information about the purpose and relevance of a land acknowledgement statement based on your experience working with others at UNC Asheville to establish a land acknowledgement there?
Sure. So, Shionagad, Trey Adcock, Galieliga Jigo Wata, Tokiasti Gea, Nongsko Tali, Agudetiada. So I'm Dr. Adcock. I am really glad to be here with you all. 104 participants is what I'm seeing. That's really amazing, and congratulate all of you for putting this event on. That's tremendous turnout and really cool support. I am from Asheville currently. I'm enrolled Cherokee Nation, Oklahoma. So if you do not know this, there are 3 federally recognized Cherokee tribes, and I won't talk so much about federal recognition, but there are 3 federally recognized Cherokee tribes. There's the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, not far where I'm from in Asheville, 45 minutes from us, kind of due west. There is the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, which I am a member of, which is 15 county jurisdiction out in the eastern part of Oklahoma, Indian territory, historically. And then there is a 3rd band, which is the United Gadua Band. We're all Cherokee, but due to colonization and other circumstances, we are 3 separate federally recognized tribes. So I'm a member of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma. I'm really grateful for this opportunity. I'm grateful to be able to talk to you. I wish Tommy would be here, but I'll do my best to fill in his shoes. He knows a lot of stuff, and I'm sure he would have had great ideas. But I do want to congratulate Wofford on taking this step towards land acknowledgement. I have worked on land acknowledgement statement at UNC Asheville. We just made ours formal this fall. But just to give you a little background, if you don't know anything about land acknowledgement statements and where they come from, I do want to really quickly differentiate between an informal land acknowledgement, which Native Indigenous people have been doing, to be honest, for thousands of years. I mean, there are some tribes that have very concrete, structured forms of acknowledgement. You can go to some tribes in the Northeast, and there's an expectation that you wait at a certain place, a certain time, and in a certain way before you are acknowledged and welcomed. I think there are some communities where it's much more of an informal disposition. They're going to watch you, and they're going to see how you act and the type of relationships you build and foster before they formally welcome you. I would say, as a Cherokee person, I just wrote something for the Appalachian Trail magazine, and how I think about land acknowledgement. And every fall, I'll just tell this really quick story. I go hiking with an elder. He's a friend of mine. I learn a lot from him. He's a first language speaker. And we go hunting for what are called wishi. Wishi is a type of mushroom. A lot of people know them as hen of the woods. And so we go hike around, and we look for these mushrooms. They're sort of a delicacy. So for a lot of Cherokee people, they still forage in the woods. In late winter, we'll go find ramps. For me, as a Cherokee person currently, that relationship to the land and what it provides to us, and that connection to language, to culture, and I would say to other people, that's my land acknowledgement. And I do that every day. For Cherokee people historically, one of the things you did every single morning is you went to water, and you gave thanks to the Creator for another day and for the sun coming up. To me, that's a form of land acknowledgement. Now I play stickball in the Eastern Band community for a team called Walela, the Hummingbirds. And after you play, you go to the river, and you take all the anger and frustration of that game, and you wash it off your body in the river, and you wash it downstream. And it's squashed. Whatever beef you have is squashed. That's another form of land acknowledgement. So I just want to recognize that for Indigenous people, that's been happening on the daily for thousands of years. What we're talking about is much more of a formal, bureaucratic, institutional statement. And those, have some history to them now. Australia, well, they have what's called welcome to country statements taken from a Maori ceremony where you exchange gifts. So they're prevalent in New Zealand as well. Canada is probably the best example for the United States, and they probably have a 30 to 40-year history in Canada. I mean, if you go to Canada, you're going to see land acknowledgements. I went to the University of Toronto a couple summers ago. The first thing I was handed, and it wasn't even a class session, they handed me a land acknowledgement and a copy of the Truth and Reconciliation recommendations that they're going through up there. In the United States, you're talking about the last 20 years. And I would say more common in the last 10 years, very common in the last 5 years. Some institutions are doing them better than others, but they are becoming really prevalent. And I will say that now there is a healthy discourse. There is a critique of them. And some of us have talked about that before. And I think that's a healthy thing. I think there is a critique of them and bringing up questions of, who should be doing it. What purpose do they actually serve? And I think the most important question, which I think we'll get to tonight, is, what comes next? And so in the United States, they are still relatively new. They are still spreading. But I do want to say, despite the critique, I was just having this conversation with some colleagues actually yesterday, I still think they're powerful. And I still think they're important. And so I applaud Wofford for going down this step, because how many people walk your campus, and I can tell you walk UNC Asheville's campus, they have no idea. We have almost 4,000 students, and if there is no land acknowledgement statement, they are not mindful of that space. And the history that went into that space, and I particularly love Wofford's statement of acknowledgement and labor. And that's really, really powerful and something I think UNC Asheville could potentially add. But I do think as an initial step, they're powerful, they're important, they can shift consciousness. And you take something like, I don't know if you guys have seen, there's been several articles written about land grab universities from the Morrill Act of 1862 and these land grant universities. I'm a graduate, my PhD is from Chapel Hill. I didn't realize this. But the first 50 years of that institution, for the most part, was funded primarily through the sale of indigenous lands, not just in North Carolina, but in Eastern Tennessee, that were Cherokee and Chickasaw lands that were either, through removal or breaking treaties. So I do think that, a land acknowledgement can shift that narrative, can challenge that history. And I think just at a base level, it's an acknowledgement of the land that you are on currently is the territorial space of some indigenous nation. And therefore, what does that require? It requires a responsibility and a reciprocity to that land and to those people. So I hope I answered that question somewhat.
Definitely. Would you be willing to go a little bit further about what it was like to establish a land acknowledgement at UNC Asheville?
Yeah, sure. So at UNC Asheville, so I've been here 9 years. Just to give you a little bit more bio on myself, I'm an associate professor. I direct our American Indian Indigenous Studies minor program. I was the faculty advisor for our Native student group for 8 years. I work primarily with the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, working to recruit, I think most importantly, to try and retain Eastern Band students. I'm really proud of the fact that when I came 9 years ago, and this is not due to me alone, it's just circumstances, we didn't have one Eastern Band student. In the last 2 years, we have graduated, I think, 15 Eastern Band students. And to me, as an educator, that's the end game, graduating students. So I've been here 9 years. And one of the things that we did in 2015 that Wofford possibly could think about is we signed what's called a memorandum of understanding with the tribe. And I hate to say it, but those are kind of like treaties. I hate to say that. But they can also be important as both sides come to the table to build a relationship. And so that's what we did. And we give in-state tuition to Eastern Band students no matter where they're living. We reserve a certain amount of slots for Eastern Band students to attend UNC Asheville. I think on a very practical level, what it did for us is it laid forth a need and a desire to build a Native American or American Indian Indigenous Studies program. There was no curriculum on campus prior to 2015 or 2016 specifically designated. And you got to think about that in terms of American Indian history. In the 60s, students out in California, American Indian students that led to Alcatraz and some of those resistance were calling for curriculum. So we got ours in like 2016, but we did get it. We have started offering Cherokee language. So that MOU was really important. And I think what's important for the administration to understand is it is a long-term sustainable commitment. It can't be something you walk away from. And so that MOU, I mean, that's a whole different presentation. I could talk about the challenges of that. But one of the things we did do is sign an MOU. And to answer the question about the land acknowledgement, one of the things I suggested early on to administration about that MOU is to create a community council to help the institution navigate the relationship. I am the only member of faculty or staff that is Cherokee or a member of a federally recognized tribe. I don't have all the answers, and that's a lot of tricky space to navigate. And so luckily, about a year and a half ago, I got funding to put this community group together. I think it's the most powerful thing that UNC Asheville has done in the last 2 years. This is made up of people in Chiefs Needs Administration, some tribal council representatives. This is community members. This is also moms and grandmothers. This is alumni of the institution. And so we put this group together. And one of the first things we asked is, should we do a land acknowledgement statement? And to be honest, I didn't want to do one. I wasn't sure that I should do one or we should do one. Those original questions of who should be doing it came to us. Some of the younger generation was not really wanting to do one either. But we went through about 6 or 7 months of conversation, and the elders, a couple of the elders, finally spoke up and said, listen, this is an opportunity to educate people on our history on these lands. And when the elders spoke, that pretty much ended it. And so we went forward. Some people volunteered, and then we chose a couple other people to help. And that group, it's called Dini Kanawi Dido'i, which is those that oversee, they produced this land acknowledgement. The hardest conversation of that group was, should it go to tribal council? And I don't know with y'all's land acknowledgement if that's something you want to get into. How much community input do you want? Do you actually want the Eastern Band's input? And remember, there are 3 federally recognized tribes. There was a lot of conversation about that. We did send it to Chiefs Need to get his review. He liked it. He asked that we come to tribal council. So in July, we did that. Tribal council voted on it, passed it unanimously. And so that was the first step in the formal land acknowledgement. I subsequently have worked through our faculty senate to say, hey, listen, here's a land acknowledgement that y'all have been asking me about. What do you want to see happen? So that is really how it came about. In terms of the long-term relationship, I would just say one of the frameworks that we use at UNC Asheville, it's pretty basic, but it aligns with the Ray Kinsland Leadership Institute that the tribe has, and it's called the 4 R's. And it came out of Canada. It's a framework for how to work with Indigenous communities. It's pretty simple. Reciprocity, is what you're doing mutually beneficial? Respect, can students come to campus? Can community members come to campus and feel like they're respected, not just as individuals, but part of this tribal nation? Responsibility, that goes to the university having a responsibility to be good stewards of the students and of the lands that they're situated on. And then the 4th one is relevancy. Is there any, I would just say this, is there any program that is on campus that is relevant to the lives of students? And I just want to stop really quickly right there and say, a lot of times on college campus, UNC Asheville was no different, is they're gonna have programming like, hey, come see the Cherokee weaver or the Cherokee basket maker. Those things are important and those things are relevant. What is also relevant are policy and legal issues uh, like drilling, like pipelines, like the police, like education. I would tell you for the Eastern Band, like health. And so do you also give equal weight to those issues that are impacting the kids' lives and their parents' lives and their grandparents' lives? And so I think just finally, the question that, if a student shows up on your campus, do they walk away and have a good experience? And I think that's the key to building a good relationship. And that might have been long-winded, I apologize.
No, that was great. Thank you. Um, Dr. Adcock, you have provided us with extremely valuable information about land acknowledgements. I just want to build upon your previous response and gain insight into how institutions have used land acknowledgements to not only recognize Indigenous peoples in a historical framing, but also looking to the future and developing meaningful relationships with the land, and how institutions like Wofford can be better stewards of the land that they occupy. Can you share specific ways institutions have been intentional in respecting lands that they occupy?
I will do my best here. I think it's, to be honest, all over the place. A lot of institutions just do land acknowledgements. They put a plaque out on their quad or in the front. They will recognize literally any Indigenous group that ever passed through those territories, and that's the end of it. I think for my role at UNC Asheville, what I kept trying, and I'm going to be in this process for a while, thinking about is the action that comes after acknowledgement. You acknowledge, and then so what? And again, I like what y'all did, which is, including the labor piece. I think, so I'm going to break this down in a couple different ways. I think institutionally, the institution has to ask themselves, are there scholarships available for Cherokee students, for any of the 3 federally recognized tribes? Are there any spaces on campus, not just for Cherokee students, but for all Native students? Do you have any faculty? Do you have any administrators? Do you have any staff to support the students when they get on campus? I think for us in Asheville too is learning how to connect with the Indigenous population that has moved into the Asheville area. It's not a static population, and more Indigenous people are occupying the territory and moving in and out of the territory. How do we work with those groups? What are their needs? And I think ultimately, the question I have posed to our campus is, as a university community, how does our teaching, how does our research, and how does our resource allocation align with the needs of the Eastern Band? If it doesn't, are we just superficially acknowledging the land and checking a box? I think in terms of the actual land itself, there's 2 ways to think about that. I mean, I think some schools have done really cool things, and I think community gardens, which Tommy has mentioned, we have talked about that as well. I think, we have a divestment group. I mean, I don't know how controversial or political that is at Wofford, but at UNC Asheville, pushing our university to think about what are they investing in. I was at Standing Rock. These issues are not just academic issues, they are lived issues. And so what does that mean for the university and their investments in divesting? I think even in our cafeteria, thinking about, the foods we're eating. Do we represent Indigenous foods? I can tell you, I'll just tell you this one very quick story, but we do an annual farm to table dinner, and it's a really cool event. And one time they asked me, hey, can we do Cherokee foods? And so I said, yeah, man, it'll be awesome. Let's do bean bread, tuya gadu. And that's a staple in the Cherokee community. And so I handed them, a recipe. I sent them videos. I said, hey, we will have an elder come and teach you how to do it. They said, no, man, we got this. All right. And when they came to serve it, it was basically like a muffin with beans in it. Now I can tell you that ain't no daggone bean bread. And so I think having those, and they listen, it was great. It was a great event. And we all kind of laughed about it. But I do think, are you authentically representing what? And that's important, because if you know anything about Native communities, type 2 diabetes and health issues is a major concern. So are you representing that? I also would just say the other way to think about land, and I've said this before, at UNC Asheville, I think our university is doing a lot of good things. There is no chance they're giving the land back. And let's just keep it real. However, can we conceptualize land in a different way? So can you honor the land through how you allocate resources on campus? Can you honor the land through the curriculum and how you teach about it? And I will tell you, that's one of the major battles we're facing at UNC Asheville right now, is how do we do that? Does that mean just sort of integrating it in, because we have a 4-sequence humanities, do we integrate it into that 4-sequence? Or there's now a push, do we have a required freshman Indigenous history course? There are resource challenges to that. So I think in terms of like, what are things to be done around the land? I think there's a lot to be done. But I think we also have to be real and practical in terms of, like, I don't see any university packing up and giving the land back. And I think it's also a question of, do even tribal nations want the land back? And that doesn't mean that they don't want it intellectually, but you also have to manage that land. And that's a different conversation. And Tommy could have talked more about that. So, just off the top of my head, I think those are some things to think about. And that's how I would answer that. Last thing I would add, I think another initiative to think about, and I think it would be well received in the community, and I'm hopeful that UNC Asheville will do this, is something like an elder in residence program, where you have an elder come from the community and maybe they only spend a day. I don't think that's enough, but maybe they spend a week. There are some schools where they spend possibly up to a semester on campus, just talking to students, they don't even necessarily teach. They're just there to be there in that space. And I think the way that I thought about that early on was we should have Cherokee language there. And that's not necessarily possible for everybody, but there is a lot of teleprompting around the language. I took Cherokee language when I was at Chapel Hill, which is 5 hours away. And so I think the Cherokee language is also important, and it's a major need of the tribe.
Thank you for those specific and intentional and authentic initiatives, Dr. Adcock. Is there anything that you would have done differently, knowing what you know now, if you could go back to the beginning of the land acknowledgement process at UNC Asheville? And if so, is there any advice you would give to institutions like Wofford endeavoring to create an official land acknowledgement?
I truthfully, I think after seeing what y'all are thinking about with land and labor, I think that's a terribly missed opportunity for UNC Asheville. And I wish we would have talked about that. I wish we would have thought about that. I think we have to build bridges and I'm just talking about our campus. I think one of the dangers of our campus as a primarily white institution is that you're fighting over resources, and you have to be careful not to turn on each other. And I can, anyways, I'll just stop there. So I think I really applaud y'all for doing that. I think exploring that really deeply. Cherokee history is complicated. And so I get a lot of people in Western North Carolina that will come up to me and say they're Cherokee, and I'm not the identity police, but when that person says that, do they own all of that Cherokee history? And I think one of the things we have to acknowledge is that Cherokees owned slaves. That is a part of that history. And so I think, intersectionality, exploring all of those different relationships and connections is vital. And so that's a regret I have about our land acknowledgement statement, is that we did not do that, especially in the home of the Biltmore that was built on the backs of African Americans. In terms of the advice, I think, man, I really just applaud y'all for having the conversation and taking the step forward. I think, I don't have any answers. I think the questions I pose to y'all hopefully are questions that you find relevant to what you're thinking about and doing. I think one question is you have to decide is, how much community involvement do you want in that acknowledgement? And I can't answer that. And that provides its own challenges. But I think just taking the initial step, I think it's important. I think it's a good thing. And, really grateful to be here to talk to y'all about it. But that's all I got.
Thank you, Dr. Adcock, so much for sharing your wisdom and time with us. I would now like to turn the conversation over to Dean Taifa for the Q&A portion of the program.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you, Dr. Adcock, for such an insightful discussion, which I am extremely hopeful will benefit Wofford College administrators in developing an intentional and meaningful official college land acknowledgement. So at this time, I have a few questions. And this first question kind of builds on some of what I perceived as some frustrations that you might have experienced in the process of implementing a land acknowledgement at UNC Asheville. And so this question is specifically asking about some of the critiques of land acknowledgements and whether or not you faced or the community members at UNC Asheville when trying to institutionalize this land acknowledgement had any sort of critiques that came up in the process.
Yeah, thank you for that question. That's a good question. I think I'll just say broadly that, I mean, I think there are several critiques, but I think probably the most significant is again, so you've written this acknowledgement statement. I mean, who is it really serving? Whose purpose is it really serving? And I love my institution. I'm just saying that potentially sometimes we get caught up in doing things because they look good on paper, and so I'll just say that. So in terms of our particular acknowledgement, I haven't heard any critiques, and I'll tell you, I think the community group and it coming from the community was a big reason why. I mean, I was worried when it went to faculty senate that, I'm an academic, I'm critiquing myself too, that we would unfortunately get caught up in the semantics. It's not a perfectly written statement. I think we have two of them. So we have a short one that is for events, and that's one of just the practical questions. Like, is this going to be at every single event? Is this just at graduation? Is this at sporting events? Who gives it? And so we had that conversation, and we decided our answer to that was we would come up with two. We would come up with a short one that's about a paragraph, kind of about as long as the one you just gave. That would be a land acknowledgement statement for practical purpose. But we also have a much longer one that's really about 3 pages that goes through the treaty history that specifically addresses the history of the land that UNC Asheville sits on. I think there is a follow-up, which this is the lesson learned. I wish we would have thought about this sooner with our administration, but I think it needs a dynamic web page and presence to sit on, resources to accompany it, an actual link to the people that you're acknowledging, maybe articles and videos and whatever that address some of the issues. So in terms of our acknowledgement, there's some, I think there's some things maybe that we could have done different, or, we're still working on it. It's an evolving document that's live, so it will go through evolutions, but I haven't heard many critiques. But I think the larger critique about land acknowledgements, the one I was concerned with that didn't make me want to do it, was, I wasn't really sure what we were doing it for. And most importantly, really who we were doing it for, ourselves or actually for the community. And, that was just something I struggled with, and, the elders spoke and we followed.
Thank you so much. The next question speaks a little bit towards a specific initiative that you mentioned, the Elder in Residence program. And so folks are interested in hearing a little bit more about that, and specifically what reciprocity looks like in these programs in terms of appropriately compensating elders.
That's so I'll just say, what does it look like? Well, I think different institutions do it differently. I mean, like the University of Toronto, they have multiple elders in residence. They have but Toronto's different. Canada's different. There's a different consciousness up there, especially because they have a national truth and reconciliation, and those mandates have made it way into the institution. And so you're talking about multiple indigenous languages being taught. You're talking about multiple elders, some just there to counsel students as they navigate the institution. Some as a special counsel to the chancellor, some to offer curriculum, some to, to teach, some to offer mini classes. At Chapel Hill, I remember we had Robert Conley, who's a really famous Cherokee writer. He just came for a week and you could go to lunch with him. You could take your writing samples and get writing advice. You could just honestly go to breakfast with them and listen to stories. And it was about just spending time with that elder. So I think it can look different depending on what you want to do. If it was me at UNC Asheville and I had an unlimited budget, I would not just bring, I would probably bring, elders from maybe multiple tribes to have a conversation around a topic. I think that would be really cool. I would obviously have Cherokee elders come and present what they feel comfortable with. I think, to be honest, it also depends who's it for. For our Native student population, we do breakfast. I go to breakfast with them every Friday. And so I think just going to breakfast with them and an elder so they can be comforted and reassured. I will tell you that we have an elder in our Cherokee language class. And so one of the conversations, and I don't know how Wofford would deal with this, but I'll just tell you one of the issues we got in with Cherokee language is we had a mandate at that time that the person to teach Cherokee language had to have a PhD. Well, if you don't know anything about Cherokee language, I got to be honest, people, that's like finding a unicorn. And I have a 9-year-old at home and they look every day for a unicorn, and that is a difficult task. And that just was not feasible. We now are not in that mandate. And it wasn't feasible because one, the Eastern Band, there's less than 200 speakers. And then two, to have a PhD in the language, I mean, that just does not exist. And so they were putting an impossible requirement on us. And so we don't have that mandate anymore, but that is one, I mean, an elder spends all semester teaching a class in the language. That's really cool. And it's not just about language with him. He does a coffee hour, for students, and not just Cherokee students, for all students. And they come, he goes hiking with them sometimes on the weekends. It's just a different presence on campus than you would normally have.
Absolutely. Thank you for that response. And I think this next question kind of builds on that. And you've talked about this and alluded to it in your responses to Sarah. Do you have any other or any additional advice on how institutions specifically can support Native students, right? And thinking about your response to Sarah, you mentioned, well, are there any supports, right? Whether that's in student life or whether there are faculty who are tenure track. Do you have any other specific examples like that that might be helpful in helping those of us on the call understand how we could better support our Native students?
Yeah, and I think it goes back to the second part of the question you had asked me, which is about reciprocity. And I think, so I've written about this. I have worked with Native students on our campus now for 9 straight years as a faculty advisor for the student group, as an academic advisor, as just someone on campus that wants to support them. And you have to build a holistic system around them. And that includes, Western Carolina has someone, they have different resources and different relationships because they're close, but they have a staff person that is dedicated to that relationship. And I'm just telling you that most universities that want a deep relationship with a university, with the tribal community, has someone on campus whose almost sole purpose is to build that relationship and to foster that relationship. And so that person is important. I just finished a research project interviewing all of our graduates for the last 5 to 7 years. And that person on campus is essential to them finishing. I think universities do believe that you have to have Native faculty, and you do. I mean, they need to see people that look like themselves. But I will tell you that when we interviewed them, the other thing that students really appreciated and supported is to have professors in their class, whether they knew about Native history and Native culture or not, that just allowed them space to take whatever they were teaching and learning about and connect it back home. That like they provided story after story of connecting what they were learning in a class to their tribal community. That was vital. Do they need a Native student group? I mean, all of the research shows that they, those things help. I think the most important thing is they need spaces to build relationships that reflect their home communities. And so having people on campus, of course, almost every single one of our Eastern Band students that have graduated have minored in American Indian Indigenous Studies. And I will tell you that partly it's due to the curriculum. They want to learn this stuff. I can tell you, like with Cherokee language, it's partly just to be with each other in a space on a campus that is predominantly white. And so I will just tell you that UNC Asheville has also learned some hard lessons, and that you can't skip any of those steps or any of those pieces. It has to be well-intentioned. It has to be built from the ground up. There has to be community input and buy-in. And if it's, I'm not trying to fetishize, but if it's a circle, and if it's good, if it's right, it will work, and it will be successful. And we've lost students too, and not always our fault. But I do think that in terms of supporting Native students all the way to graduation, you have to build a holistic system prior to coming to campus. I mean, even things like, I've been on, the day that we've had our opening ceremony for the fall semester, I've been in the financial aid office filling out financial aid for kids because they might have been homeless. They didn't have anybody in their house who ever been to college. So some of the first generation literature would fall into that as well. And not all of them are first gen. But I do think that, probably the most important thing you can do if you really want a deep relationship is to have someone on campus who is going to be in the position for more than a semester or two that is committed to that relationship and can oversee it.
Thank you so much for that response. There are a few other questions here. However, I do want to just be able to answer them for the larger group, just in case. And so, Dr. Adcock, I do appreciate you being here in your capacity and your involvement of being an active member of the group that established and institutionalized UNC Asheville's land acknowledgement. And so there are questions here about non-federally recognized tribes and land acknowledgements, and questions about, navigating relationships on kind of borderland, right? So if there are multiple tribes that an institution is occupying the land that's on multiple tribes, ancestral lands, like how to navigate those experiences. And I know that we don't have as much time in the world, but if you're comfortable answering either of those questions or both of them.
So I'll just, say really quickly, UNC Asheville was daggum lucky. It's very clear. The history is very clear. It was Cherokee land. I will tell you though, from all of my community engaged scholarship and work, I had been hearing things that were challenging that narrative. So if there was one reason why I wanted to do a land acknowledgement statement as a Cherokee person, was to put forward that history and say, this is what it is. I do think though that we have to be careful with like territorial understandings and ownership. I don't think Native people historically and Native nations thought of it as they own the land. I think it was recognized territory for different purposes. And so it can get complicated. I mean, there can be multiple tribes, and there are definitely universities that have had to like work through that. I can't really speak to that because I have not had to do that because it was so clear that it was Cherokee land. I would also say that in North Carolina, the state recognized tribes are in the east. And I will just say this about my role is that I am a public educator as well. I started in the public schools. And so while I am a Cherokee person, and the land acknowledgement is for Cherokee lands, you know, I support who walks through that door. And I'm very proud of the fact that we have graduated and successfully navigated to graduate school Lumbee students, multiple Lumbee students. And so, you know, those are hard, but those, just being realistic, those are very hard conversations. I know that, I won't name the institution, they tried to do a student housing. So I know one of the things about supporting students is living learning communities. And some universities have tried that. And so, you know, I think that you need people that can really facilitate those tough conversations, because they, you know, if you're not Native and you're not in those political realities, those boundaries, unfortunately, while absolutely an artifact of colonization, are also very real and present in people's lives. And, you know, those are just tough conversations to navigate.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for those responses. At this time, I want to turn the program over to Dr. Thomas to deliver some resources and our closing for tonight's event.
Thank you so much. So in the chat, I am sharing a link to a Google Doc that is a resource for all of our audience members. So this is a resource guide that our subcommittee has created, which includes a proposed statement of acknowledgement for Wofford College and resources for our audience, including more materials on acknowledgements, organizations you can support, educational guides for teachers and students of all ages, and also lists of Indigenous writers and artists, plus social media accounts, podcasts, and playlists that you might want to check out. But please note that this barely scratches the surface of what's out there, but we hope that it will at least provide a starting point for those who are interested in learning more. And this is a list that we're going to try to keep updating. So if you'd like to submit suggestions, please feel free to contact me at the email address that's posted at the bottom of the guide. And in closing, I just wanted to say thank you so much to Dr. Adcock, to the Indigenous Peoples Heritage Month Planning Committee, to my fellow subcommittee members, Dean Taifa Alexander, and to Sarah Gary, and also to Nadia Glover and Dr. Sissy Fowler for their invaluable assistance. And to all who joined in, thank you so much for spending this time with us.
And that concludes our event. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you, Dr. Adcock. It was a very, very insightful discussion, and I hope that you all thought so as well.
Yeah, thank y'all for the invitation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Adcock.
Thank you.
Did it all go on you?
Thanks to everybody.